You know how you see those health headlines that seem just way too simple to be true? Well, a lot of the time, the real story is buried in the data, just waiting for someone to use the right tools to uncover it. So today, we're basically going to be medical detectives. We're going to see exactly how researchers solve these kinds of statistical mysteries. Let's jump right into our first case. Okay, so imagine you're scrolling and you see this. A study claims that just being male is a risk factor for malaria. And you might think, okay, maybe. But as you're about to see, the truth is almost always a little more complicated than a simple headline. So let's take a look at the first piece of evidence. All right, here's the raw data from our hypothetical study. We've got 150 people who got malaria, those are the cases, and 150 people who didn't. There are controls. And right off the bat, you can see it, right? More men are in the cases column and more women are in the controls column. So at first glance, yeah, this seems to back up the headline. But is this really the whole story? So when you actually crunch these numbers, you get what's called an odds ratio. And in this case, it's 1.71. Now, what does that mean? Well, think of it like this. The odds of a man having malaria in this study are 71% higher than for a woman. It seems pretty clear-cut, right? Case closed? Well, not so fast.
This is where the real detective work kicks in. That 1.71, that's our first clue, but it could be a total red herring. There might be something else going on, a hidden accomplice, let's say, that's really pulling the strings behind the scenes.
And that hidden accomplice has a name. It's called a confounding variable. A confounder is some other factor that's connected to both things you're studying. In our case, something that's linked to a person's gender and their risk of getting malaria. And what it does is create a totally fake or distorted connection. It's the classic case of mistaken identity, but for statistics. So how do we find this thing?
We use a really clever technique called stratification. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like shining a light through a prism. We're going to take our big block of data and split it into different layers, or strata, to see if that original connection we saw holds up when we look closer. And the process itself is actually pretty simple. First, we come up with a hypothesis. What else could be related to both gender and getting bitten by mosquitoes? Maybe their occupation. People who work outside probably get more mosquito bites. So second, we divide our data into two piles, people with mostly outdoor jobs and people with mostly indoor jobs. And finally, we just recalculate the odds for each of those smaller groups.
Okay, let's look at our first slice, the outdoor workers. We recalculate the odds ratio for just these people, and would you look at that, it's 1.06. Now, an odds ratio of 1 means there's zero association, no link at all. So 1.06 is so close to 1.0 that the link has basically vanished. For people working outdoors, gender doesn't seem to matter for malaria risk. And now for the indoor workers. Here, the odds ratio is exactly 1.00. It's perfect. Within this group, there's absolutely, positively no difference in malaria risk between men and women. The whole mystery is starting to unravel. So, just by slicing the data, we found the truth. That first clue was totally misleading. It's time for the big reveal. Let's put it all together and see what our investigation really uncovered. This really shows you the power of stratification. On the left, you've got that initial misleading number, 1.71, which suggested a pretty strong link. But on the right, after we accounted for occupation, you see the reality. The odds ratios are both right around 1.0. The association just disappeared. So here's the bottom line. It was never about being male and getting malaria. The real connection was between working outdoors and getting malaria. Occupation was our confounder. Why? Because in this particular group of people, men were just way more likely to have outdoor jobs. Mystery solved. It's a perfect example of why we always say correlation doesn't equal causation. You gotta look for those hidden factors. But here's the thing. Stratification doesn't always just make an association go away. Sometimes it does something even more interesting. It reveals that the story is actually way more complex and that one single answer isn't good enough for everybody. So let's pose a new question. What happens when our tool doesn't erase the connection, but instead shows that a risk factor is, say, a really big deal for one group of people, but not so much for another? This is a phenomenon called effect modification. In plain English, it just means the effect of something is modified by some other factor, like age. And this is a huge deal for public health. Check out this real-world example looking at oral contraceptive use and heart attack risk.
The overall number, the crude odds ratio for all women, is 1.7. Okay, but when researchers stratified by age, something really incredible emerged. For younger women, the risk was through the roof, an odds ratio of around 8. But for older women, it was much, much lower, maybe around 3. And this chart just makes that difference pop. It's crystal clear. The risk is not the same for everyone. Here, age is an effect modifier. And this is why just reporting one single average number for everyone would have been so dangerous. It would have completely hidden this crucial, potentially life-saving detail. But, as powerful as this stratification technique is, it does have its limits. What if you suspect there are 5 or 10 possible confounders? You'd have to slice your data into so many tiny little groups that you wouldn't have enough people in any one of them to get a reliable answer. It also makes you take things like age or blood pressure and shove them into these clunky categories. So for the really complex problems, you need an even bigger toolkit. And that brings us to the next level, multivariable analysis. These are really sophisticated statistical models, things like logistic regression, that can basically do what we just did with stratification, but for a ton of variables all at once. The best analogy is a sound mixing board, but for data. It lets researchers isolate the effect of just one thing while mathematically turning down the volume on all the other potential confounders to see what's really driving the association. So, we've seen how researchers have to look past the obvious to get to the real story. They have to check for those hidden accomplices, the confounders, and they have to see if the story is different for different kinds of people. It's a great reminder that the first and simplest answer usually isn't the right one. Which really just leaves one last question. The next time you see one of those bold health headlines, what hidden factors, what potential confounders will you wonder about?